Hello, everyone, and welcome to the With Chinese Characteristics podcast. I'm Natalie.
I'm Cherry.
Together, we talk about topics with Chinese characteristics.
Whatever those may be.
Whatever they might be. And this week, we're revisiting Chinese democracy, part 2, CCP edition, communist edition.
Yeah.
So, Cherry, let's take it away.
As a disclaimer, because you said we're revisiting Chinese democracy. Whenever there's a word of democracy or elections in this episode, I want you, our listeners, to automatically put a quotation mark around it. Just so that we're not mistaking this episode is ammunition for the tankies out there.
Yeah,
we don't want it is to not.
Oversell it.
So last time we talked about the introduction of the concept of democracy elections in China dating back to the mid-19th century. You don't have to listen to the last episode to follow along with this one, but of course, it is highly recommended by us. Every cook praises her own broth.
Wow.
And today, we're going to talk about voting and elections under the CCP government.
Voting, quote unquote, and quote unquote elections underneath the communist government.
Yes. And it did not start in 1949, even though that's when China had become a new China.
When China stood up.
Liberated. But CCP's experience with quote-unquote elections dated back to earlier than 1949, as early as 2 decades prior. And I want to start with this piece of writing titled, China, Democracy That Works. And this is a white paper released by the Information Office, which is basically the press office of the Chinese State Council in 2021.
Oh, wow. Okay. So this is modern.
Yeah.
Okay.
This year marks the 100th anniversary of the founding of the Communist Party in China. Over the past 100 years, the Chinese people have truly become the masters of the country, society, and their own destiny.
Wow.
So then, in this white paper, it explains that what China has today, quote, is the whole process of people's democracy.
Not just a half process.
We have realized the unity of process democracy and outcome democracy, procedural democracy and substantive democracy, direct democracy and indirect democracy. People's democracy and the will of the state are highly aligned. It is a democracy with full coverage of every step of the process. And it is the most extensive, real, and effective socialist democracy in the world.
Wow, Cherry.
So the work is done. We can end this episode now.
Yeah.
Just kidding. The reason I wanted to start this episode with that is because, in the last episode, I expressed how I was not happy that some German and Finnish NGOs basically said that China might be a democracy. Just depends on the definition of democracy, right? But to be fair, the Chinese propaganda, like the one I've just read, is definitive statement.
Yeah.
They're like, whatever democracy you want, we have it.
It is.
Yeah, this is a wholesale situation.
Problems other democracies have, we don't have.
Yeah.
We've solved it all.
Well, they're making opposite statements in the one sentence.
Yeah.
And it's completely illogical, but it doesn't really matter.
Yeah.
So, in the white paper, though, they keep mentioning that the CCP's establishment dates back to 1921, and it's been over 100 years. Likewise, the history of elections under the CCP rule and started in the late 1920s and early 1930s.
One thing that I think people underestimate about Chinese censorship, or I guess like censorship is too
light of a word.
Yeah, it's more like thought shaping or narrative shaping.
You mean brainwashing?
Well, yeah, exactly. I mean, well,
we have done an episode on that.
We did brainwash, but like that's very specific, right? Brainwashing is a specific technique. This is more like you shape narratives of society. And like, I know people are surprised sometimes to find things like, 1984 is not banned in China, right? It's like, it's not.
It's not.
Cherry read it as a school kid. And it's like, the thing is, though, is you're just taught to say, this is what China would be without the party, right? Like, you're like, this is what other bad places are like, right?
Well, if you read the online book notes of 1984, you will find that most people go, yeah, exactly. Winston was so happy at the end. Like they're taking it literal,
Yeah.
willingly or knowingly or unknowingly.
Yeah, but
It's a good thing.
Yeah. And like regardless though, it's like it's
Yeah.
not like if Chinese people only knew about democracy, it's like no, they know about
They know
democracy.
about
Right?
Well, okay, now
just
we're
hasn't-
getting into a territory of blaming the people.
No, I'm not. I'm just saying
Okay.
it's just like no, we've got democracy at home.
Yeah.
Right? Like it's a whole narrative that is already prepared like for all these external influences.
So you're saying the CCP and the propaganda machine,
Yeah.
they don't just make a statement and say we have democracy.
No.
They have made this web of
Yeah.
lies and concepts and narratives that all work together, and it's really hard to combat it as
Yeah.
a everyday person.
Yeah.
Who also, I mean, you have no other choice, by the way. You live under the regime.
Yeah.
Even through the looking glass, from the outside in,
Yeah.
it's hard to navigate.
Well, I think you were even surprised yourself when you started doing more and more research into this topic, how much time and effort and manpower was put in to just all of this. It's not just like, oh yeah, we have democracy, it's great, you know what I mean? And we do fake votes now and then. It's like
They're not necessarily even fake
Yeah.
fake votes.
Anyway, okay.
But they're not a democracy. Let's just,
Yeah.
Again, sometimes I feel like our podcast can be misconstrued. It's also Natalie likes
being sarcastic.
clickbait titles, which I always feel very uneasy about. What if they don't get the joke? Okay, so in the 1930s, as soon as the party had controlled territories in some parts of China, namely Jiangxi province, and established the Chinese Soviet Republic, an election law was established along with many other laws. They had land reform law, they had constitutional draft, they had marriage laws.
Yeah, listen to our marriage episode.
Yeah. So, the Chinese Soviet Republic was very much real and had strict social control and reform within the territory. Convenient for me, and lucky for our podcast, there was no shortage of materials of how the CCP practiced democracy and elections, both in quotation marks, in the Chinese Soviet Republic. And these records are still widely available today because this is the glorious history of the party. This is a good thing how they conducted these elections and practices of quote unquote democracy. So when I say materials, I also mean propaganda. Okay, just keep in mind. But nevertheless, even in propaganda, we can find patterns in how the CCP operated elections by going back to the very beginning. And there is a trace of pattern to today.
Yeah.
So, the constitution and the election laws of the Chinese Soviet Republic define who can and cannot vote, who had the political freedom, quote unquote freedom, and who did not. So are you ready? We're going to go through that.
So this is like citizen versus non-citizen, essentially.
Yes. Really, revolutionaries versus counter-revolutionaries.
People versus
non-people.
Non-people, right?
Yeah, like if you got COVID in China today,
Yeah.
you would not be in the people category.
No.
Okay, so in the Constitution it said, under the Soviet regime, all workers, farmers, soldiers of the Red Army, and all toiled people have the right to elect representatives to control the administration of the regime. Okay? And then the election law even expanded on that, sort of a brief definition, right? And it said, all employed workers and their families, all self-reliant people and their families. And this means, workers, employees, poor peasants, middle peasants, independent workers.
Okay.
Everyone who worked for someone else, I guess. Also, though, it had a caveat where it said, among these people who lost their ability to work during the election or are currently unemployed, they can vote too.
Okay.
Taking care of the troubled youth. The unemployed, I guess that's the population you want to tam.
Yeah, you want to get on your side.
Yeah. So, people who cannot vote, in the Constitution it said, only warlords, bureaucrats, landlords, gentry, capitalists, rich peasants, monks, and all exploiters and counter-revolutionaries are those who do not have the right to elect representatives, nor do they have the right to be politically free. This seems a long list, Election law also expanded on that list. So anyone who employ others' labor for profit, not good. Anyone who rely on capital profit from the land and other properties for the living, Not good. Agents of landlords. So agents of landlords, not the workers, right? Even though they work for the landlords, but they're agents of landlords.
Okay.
Intermediaries, and all those who rely on missionary superstition as a profession. So, we don't like the priests, the monks, the missionaries, the Taoists, and none of those people. KMT government and other reactionary government, police, detectives, soldiers, bureaucrats, warlords, and all involved. It also bans people who have a mental illness and those who have already been stripped of their political rights.
Okay.
The drawing of the districts, I thought that was interesting. So basically it said that the districts will be drawn first by the industrial workers' factories, meaning it's not solely based on where people live and their residence. It's like the workers' union got to vote together and they have their own representatives. But they got to live elsewhere, I guess, right? But it doesn't matter. It doesn't need to be logical.
I think in Mao, in the communist vision, everybody lives in dormitories by the factory. So.
And here's my favorite. At the end of the constitution, it said, only the proletariat can lead the broad masses of peasants and toiled people to socialism. The Chinese Soviet regime gave the proletariat special rights during elections and increased the proportion of proletarian representatives, which they did do. For example, if you are a industrial worker, you have one representative for every 500 people. But if you're handicraftsman's group, you have one representative for every 1,000 of you.
That's interesting.
If you're a farmer, you have one representative every 1,500 of you.
This is not very Maoist right here, right? Because this is more Soviet then.
Yeah.
Because this is valuing the...
It is the Chinese Soviet
right.
Republic.
So this must have been before Mao fully got his claws into it, because this is valuing factory workers more than peasants, which would align with like what Russia did.
Yeah.
Okay.
But these were the early days. 1930s. He was in the process of grasping onto his power very firmly. I think he was already quite powerful by the time.
Yeah.
But I think Mao himself is evolving too.
Oh yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So it all comes to a head later, but from here on we start the history of elections under the CCP rule. And Mao actually said this, quote, in order to combat counter-revolutionary forces and improve the warfare of workers and peasants, we must use election methods to elect the most conscious, advanced, and active members, and weed out the useless elements among the old personnel. This is the most important task.
Not the most qualified.
No.
The most active and class conscious.
Exactly.
Well, I guess class consciousness is
that qualifies you.
Yeah.
Yeah. This was political from the very beginning. And the role of election was different from when it was earlier in China, when how the Qing officials and the reformers, or even the nationalist government, had understood it. They thought elections were a way to educate the people, to tie people closer to the state. And obviously, there's some of that elements in the CCP voting rules as well. However, most importantly, though, it was to weed out the enemies amongst the people. In just 2 years, from 1931 to 1933, there were 3 large-scale elections within the Chinese Soviet Republic.
Okay.
In all those 3 elections, the voter participation rate of most districts were over 80%.
Wow.
And a few districts were over 95%.
Really serious about democracy.
Very serious. But remember, it was the participation rate of eligible voters. So there was a lot of people not eligible as well. So take that with a grain of salt. Also, I don't know if I believe in they didn't have ballots. It's all, which we're going to get into. So how were these quote-unquote highly participated elections conducted, and how did people vote? The following record came from the National People's Congress magazine, which is, I guess, I'm going to treat that as the official propaganda record, right? So, first of all, the list of approved voters and those deprived of the right to vote shall be announced by the local Soviet government 5 days before the election.
Okay, so you have to get your name pulled out of if you're not allowed to vote.
Not the candidate gets announced.
No.
The voters and the non-voters will be announced.
Yeah.
And not just the voters. If you can't vote, you'll be publicly shamed.
Yeah.
Yeah. The Electoral Committee shall collect the opinions of various mass organizations before the election and announce the list of candidates.
Okay.
So, who decides who the candidates are? The Electoral Committee. Who's that? The party. Easy.
Yeah.
So, once they have posted the list of candidates, the masses can write comments after the names of the candidates,
Okay.
even prior to the election. The article said, by mobilizing the masses to supervise, it had played an important role in the entry gate of good representatives. So, at this stage, not only maybe they go vote later, but really the selection or the snitching happens beforehand.
Yeah.
And here's...
not even like, it doesn't even necessarily need to be real. It could just be somebody you have a beef with and you just write landlord.
Yeah.
Right? And then like...
How useful.
It's anonymous,
How
right?
convenient.
Yeah.
Yeah. And here's what I mean by there are a lot of records on this coming from the CCP its archives itself. And they're still writing about this today because, last year was the 100th anniversary of the party establishment. So there was all these propaganda pieces and articles written by all party officials published everywhere, singing the glories of the party and its history, right? So even though I'm reading this and I'm thinking how scary and undemocratic this is, they're posting the list of voters and non-voters and the list of representatives for people to snitch on beforehand. But they were presenting it as if it was a positive to this day. Right? And if you ask anyone today in America, say, hey, do you think anyone who's not eligible for vote should have their names posted on the I don't know, in the town square?
Yeah.
Not that we have town squares anymore today. And everyone will be like, why would you do that?
Yeah.
Right? In China today.
Well, also, the thing is, though, is like in the U.S., people don't vote for apathy like more than being disenfranchised.
Yes.
And it sounds like in China during this time period, being unable to vote meant a lot more than being unable to vote. It basically meant you're not a citizen of the new China.
You're not a citizen. Everyone is welcome to step on you at this point on, including the state. So 90 years has passed since the 1930s, right?
Yeah.
And we have not moved forward, or I guess the party has not moved forward. I think the people have. But, okay, so during the election, the candidates are discussed one by one by the voters. It's not really that you go to the voting booth and you cast your vote. It's more like a rally. It's more like a discussion session. So if a candidate is opposed by the majority of voters, the original proposal shall be withdrawn and another candidate shall be proposed immediately, either by the electoral committee or by the masses. Really, it's like a town hall meeting. It's like a struggle session.
But it's worse because that means like if the party has a favorite candidate, then you have to go out on record saying you don't like them.
Yeah, which you don't want to do that.
Which they're going to know.
Yeah. So in those days, in the forms of town halls, voting were mostly conducted vocally by a show of hands. And then in some villages, there was also bean voting as a creative solution to mobilize political support from the illiterate and rural population. Voters placed beans in a bowl, which was placed behind each candidate. And even though the candidate themselves faced the other way, everyone else, including election supervisors, party officials, and other voters, can clearly see who voted for whom.
So no secret ballots.
No. And, these elections, according to the Communist Party, was very effective in binding people to the government. I guess it was, because it sort of told the people there's no way to escape.
Yeah.
You better participate. And they said that this made sure that people were in charge, which I find very questionable. This was also very good for propaganda, both within China and abroad. So one example, on this podcast, you know that we love the communist apologists. William Hinton, an American writer, a Marxist who lived in China from 1937 to 1953. Basically,
he stuck it out till 53.
Yeah, and then he had a long life in America, by the way, which we should do an episode on him. So he was the second most famous American sympathizer.
Besides Edward Snow. Edgar Snow.
Edgar Snow, Red Star Over China, my least favorite book. He outlived Edgar Snow too. And he served as the first national chairman of the U.S.-China People's Friendship Association from 1974 to 1976. Edgar Snow died in 1972. Missed his opportunity. So
Mao outlived Edgar Snow.
What?
Mao outlived
I
Edgar.
know. Yeah. So in Hinton's book, Fanshen, which means emancipated, a documentary of revolution in a Chinese village, he recounted local land reform efforts and elections in a Chinese village under the CCP rule during the Chinese Civil War before 1949.
Okay.
And he probably thought that he really painted a very positive picture of the CCP and its election efforts. For example, he stated that even though the Communist Party was the main organizer and the leader of, quote, democratic elections, quote, it limited its own members to 1/3 of all elective and appointed posts. And it's like, the point is that they had the power in the first place to decide on the 1/3.
Yeah.
You know, also, this was during the Japanese invasion. So the party had an incentive to keep up the appearance that the bigger threat was the Japanese, not the KMTs, and the anti-revolutionaries. Even though, I don't know if this is going to be a popular opinion, maybe it is, it was very clear that the communists had understood the Japanese invasion was good for them and not the nationalist government.
I mean, as you said, if you get to decide, okay, we'll take 1/3 of the seats, that means it's not.
It's not democratic.
But the other thing, though, is that
Yeah.
Edward Hunter, the guy who wrote the brainwashing book, he talks about this, how like up until the very minute of the kind of complete takeover of the state by the Communist Party, they kind of made it seem like it was going to be a multi-party system, right?
Yeah.
And they really didn't, snap down they didn't snap on the handcuffs until...
Yeah. So I'm saying, like, doing all these election stuff, it was good for propaganda. It was good to build up their international image. So Hinton was a true believer. Later in his life, he wrote and lectured and toured extensively abroad in America to explain the Maoist approach. And he was very vocal about how Deng Xiaoping's market-oriented reforms were a betrayal. He was not happy. Also, his sister, who's a nuclear physicist who participated in the Manhattan Project, also went to China, and there was this huge, stir.
And she was giving them nuclear secrets?
She was going to help them, but supposedly she didn't. She worked on farms. I don't know. And she was also a true believer. If you can see the picture of them, he and his sister, it's on Wikipedia. They dressed completely like two Chinese comrades. And Hinton obviously came back to America, and the FBI was on him, right? And there was all these grievances of they took away his records and blah blah blah. Well, he eventually got them back. So in CCP they would just burn it.
Yeah, he
would never get anything back. So
you'd never see the light of day.
No, ever. From his recordings, we know that not only positions like the village head, chairman, or the peasants' associations were elected. They also held elections for titles like emancipated hero, the person who did the emancipation the best, I guess.
Okay. Emancipated themselves, or okay.
That's you liberated yourself.
Okay.
Okay, so I'm sorry. The word 翻身 literally means flip over.
Okay.
Like rise up. But I don't think that's a good
it's almost
translation. It's setting yourself free.
Yeah.
Or the party set you free.
But sounds like in this case it means radicalized. Kind of though. It's
No, it means you regained your rights.
No, but I mean in reality though, it means this is the most radicalized peasant in the village. This is the one that has accepted the CCP teachings the best, right?
Or was the most gung-ho about killing the landlords.
Yeah.
Killed the most.
That's what I mean by
prize.
radicalized.
Sure.
They wouldn't see it as radicalized, but this is the most intense person. Yeah.
So titles like 翻身 hero or model land reform worker were also elected by the people.
And I just want and the problem is with some of this is obviously life was not great for Chinese peasants.
No.
Right? Okay.
This will show. He wrote about this one guy, Ho, the countryman who won the fourth highest number of votes as a model land reform worker.
Okay.
And Ho said, quote, "For the prize, I won a new plow. After the election, we heroes were invited to a grand festival in the county seat. We saw plays and operas, both old style and new. Flowers were pinned to our tunics, and we rode on horsebacks through the city. When we returned home, we were welcomed by every village along the route. The people met us with parades and music and marched us through the fields to the border of the next village." Quote. So these people, right? They probably did have a very hard life.
Yeah.
It's no easy in the Chinese countryside then or now, right?
Yeah.
And the party comes in and wine and dines you.
Yeah.
Also, they encourage you to be a good revolutionary.
Yeah. And
in some areas, it was quite a light hand. I'm sure when Hinton's there, it was not the mass murder of all landlords in the town.
Yeah.
You know, maybe, I don't know. I got to read this book, but maybe I'll find out.
They're probably not going to be stoning the landlords to death in front of Hinton.
Likely not, no.
Yeah.
So you're right.
So and this is, again, this talking about the brainwashing stuff, but like mixed in with all this stuff there is a lot of hope, right? Especially at the start of like, yeah, obviously from an outside perspective, you're like, okay, so it's not closed ballots. The party picks the candidates. You know, this all seems but when you're coming from a position of essentially having nothing.
Yeah.
It all seems very good at the start.
Yeah.
Right? And it's easy to see why.
No one has ever asked you what you think of the world.
No, exactly, right?
What you think how the country should be run.
And you don't have any metric of like how democracies are run other places or how votes are run other places. This is all very new to you.
Yeah.
And exciting,
You don't
right?
even know what rights are.
Yeah.
And they have used that. You see? Yeah. So these were still experiments.
Yeah.
Things were volatile also in these years for the CCP. They had at one point lost almost all of the Chinese Soviet Republic territory.
Yeah.
After they have gained it. The Red Army was chased over China, had to go on its long march.
Yeah.
And then the Japanese had invaded. Then we had the Civil War. So the Communist Party had other priorities that probably ranked higher than conducting elections continuously.
Yeah.
So it was, light experiments here and there. It had to liberate the country first. So in 1949, they liberated the country.
Quote unquote.
And you might say, okay, back on track with elections.
Yeah.
Not that they were on track, by the way. However, Mao seemed to have lost interest in elections all of a sudden. The mass suffrage was put off and not a priority. What was a priority, though, was class dictatorship and how to achieve it. The reason cited by the party was that, quote, once military operations has ended, Taiwan's still on the loose. Land reform is thoroughly completed and people from all sectors of society have been organized, then we can get elections again.
Well, and to, we talked about this in the Taiwan episode, but it's more than just Taiwan's there. Like they have a naval blockade over China still for like the first decade.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it is kind of, still going on, right? Korea's there, I don't know. There's a lot going on for Mao. And who cares about elections?
Yeah, Nali, but America started this independence thing. There was a council and people discussed and they were shouting, no, too much taxation, no representation.
We're very
before you had declared on
we're very fractious and opinionated people, us Americans.
Yeah.
We're not like China where we have a cultural unity,
Well, here's what they're saying. They're saying we need to have a cultural unity before we can do any of this voting stuff.
Yeah.
Even though they already did it in the Chinese Soviet Republic.
We'll let everybody vote once everybody believes the correct things.
Yeah, exactly. So some local elections in villages might have continued, but it was not official party business and it was taking a back seat.
Yeah, because I'm sure, your village needs to send a representative, so maybe you vote, right? I mean, but that's not official, right?
You put some beans in a bowl.
Yeah.
So, however, then the CCP and Mao started facing external pressure from no other than our esteemed Soviet leader.
I was about to say
Joseph Stalin.
Okay.
What? You think Mao's going to listen to America?
I guess not. I wouldn't think that it would come from Stalin.
I mean, we all know Stalin was known for his love of democracy.
Yeah.
So the CCP continued its close relationship with the Soviet Union in those years, and senior government officials would travel to Moscow to discuss agenda and seek advice.
Okay.
When Stalin pushed the question on why China hasn't started planning nationwide elections, the party explained that they felt like China's unelected interim political consultative body was held in high esteem, and no one was really pushing for it domestically, so why do we rush?
Yeah.
But Stalin disagreed. He felt like China had an image issue.
What Stalin's telling you have an image issue.
So Stalin argued that even Albania had elections. And if China and the Soviet Union can say that China has elections, whether they're real or not, it's a boost to the international image. It's good for propaganda. Which is true, right? It would be good.
I mean, it works. People still today go like, no, China has elections.
No, I know.
No, the Soviet Union had elections.
Yeah.
So it 100% works.
Yeah. So, because Stalin was always correct, and he was the big brother, China was convinced. Although, when Mao started the work under all this pressure to build an infrastructure for elections, he made no mention of Stalin's words of influence. Mao stated in 1953, quote, "The conditions are ripe for national elections. Now that military actions in the mainland have ceased, land reform is basically completed. We have killed in landlords, and people from all walks of life have been organized. Elections would identify incompetent local officials, increase economic production, and strengthen the ongoing war effort in Korea." Quote. And this time things evolved. China had adopted the single candidate election rule.
Okay.
And this was directly inherited, I guess,
Okay.
from the big brothers. So the Chinese is 等额选举. For each open position, there will be one candidate who, of course, nominated by the party.
Yeah.
But the party won't nominate two candidates. There will only be one.
Yeah.
And sometimes there'll be more than one positions open. Like, say, one district can have 3 people's representatives. Maybe it's a big district. Then there will be 3 candidates.
Yeah.
So with that, I would like to introduce our Chinese saying of the episode.
Okay.
Which is the thing that we do only sometimes when I feel like it. The Chinese saying is 一个萝卜一个坑. Each radish has its own hole. To elaborate, this means each has their own place and there's nobody to spare. So all in all, very neat, very tidy.
Yeah.
There's no one else to elect. You just go and vote yes for the single nominated candidate.
Well, can I ask a question? Maybe you're going to get into this.
Yeah.
So in the Soviet Union, you only had one option, which was you could not vote. And sometimes, although it was a gamble, if enough people didn't vote, the central government would get annoyed and they would, investigate the situation because they'd be like, why, and that was almost like a kind of a protest, but it was risky because if you didn't vote or you're telling other people not to vote, then you could get purged locally.
Yeah.
By the people there.
At this time in China, if there's less than 50% of eligible voters who showed up, there will be no vote. But if you did show up, you could vote no. You could say like this, we don't think they're good enough.
Okay.
I think it rarely happens.
Yeah.
And also, the follow-up. Here's my impression on it, because this part, there's not that much documentation that I could find. At this time, there was one political movement after the other.
Oh, yeah.
Things were extremely chaotic. So I don't know how much manpower or how much heart they had to go do it and do a follow-up.
Yeah.
Also, they're not electing local officials. They're electing people's representatives. And the people's representatives will elect their representatives. And eventually will go up and up and up, and then they will go to Beijing for a conference.
Yeah.
Does that make sense? You're not electing your mayor or party secretary.
Yeah.
That's all controlled by the party.
So it's so transparent that you don't really have any ability to impact it anyway. It's so opaque, It's so opaque that you have no ability to impact it. Okay.
Yeah. So at first, when I was fact-checking for this episode, I read through the entirety of the 1953 election law, which was very long. I could not find the statement where it says there shall be one candidate per position in there. But then, of course, that's not where they put it, because people are going to read the laws, right? Like international community are going to have access to this.
Yeah.
So the fine print was in the document released 2 months after the election law came out. The document was titled Instructions on Local Elections, and released by the Central Election Committee to be sent out to local election committees, local party branches.
Yeah.
And it said that the local election committee should nominate equal numbers of candidates to the number of people's representatives to be elected. So 1 equals to 1 equals to 1.
Yeah.
Okay? We all have an understanding here? Good.
Yeah.
So you might wonder, which you already did ask,
yeah.
Doesn't that just mean it's an uncontested election? Don't they just, because in America, right, if you run uncontested, you just win. I think it depends on, there are specific local rules.
Yeah.
But for the most part, you have won, right?
Yeah.
It's like our HOA. There are 5 open positions. People don't want to be on the HOA board. There's only 4 people running and they just win. But what if someone else says, I want to run as well?
Yeah.
What if you say, I feel like I can be my community's representative? Well, here's the beauty of it. You can't. You can't nominate yourself. Only the local election committee can nominate candidates, even though technically, according to the law, the people nominates.
Well,
But the local election committee is the people.
When they say the people, they don't mean like the people. They mean like the people, capital P, like this generic, like it's like saying God.
Class dictatorship.
Right. Or it's like when you say the cloud.
Yeah.
in like IT. It's like, oh, it's in the cloud. The cloud's got it covered, right? It's like, it's the people. The
Yeah.
people got it.
Yeah, exactly.
Can I see the people? I mean, they're all around. The people.
Yeah. So the party basically appoints someone to be the people's representative.
Yeah.
Capital P. But there still will be an election, at least the appearance of one. They still want people to go and vote for the chosen candidate.
Yeah.
If you don't go vote, this might mean that you're not revolutionary enough, and
Yeah.
it will be very obvious. If you do go vote, you have to vote yes or no to the chosen candidate. And what does that mean? What that actually means is not the candidate who's under the microscope here. It's not the party's candidate who must prove themselves to the people. It's the other way around.
Oh.
It's the voters. It's the people who must prove themselves to the party.
Yeah.
Isn't that genius?
Yeah,
I'm being sarcastic,
It's like
by
a
the way.
loyalty test.
Yeah.
And I think it's important what you said
By design.
about the constant political movements, because in the Soviet Union, there's periods of time where things are fairly casual,
Yeah.
as much as they can be in a autocratic Soviet republic. But I mean, this is Mao. This is Maoist China. Every year there's a new mass movement, right? There's a new economic campaign. There's a new political campaign.
Yeah.
There's something, right?
Yeah, we're going to get into
Yeah.
that. Yeah. So, before anyone goes, it's not like China has done better. It's not like we had real voting before. But actually, China has. This is very different from the previous elections, especially the ones from the Republic of China in the first half of the 20th century. And we're not saying those are fair and open elections.
Yeah.
But a certain amount of competition of office did exist.
Oh, yeah.
And of course, the state had a preferred outcome, and they had the resources to play a heavy hand. However, they could not fully control oppositions and outcomes of every election.
Yeah.
So, okay, the CCP decided that it's going to follow the Soviet Union's model of single candidate election. What's next? Well, there's still a lot of work to be done. In order to truly achieve the goal of using elections as a means for social control, they needed organizations and a thorough system to comb through every part of the country. They needed to label each citizen as either an eligible voter or a counter-revolutionary.
So they had done this before, but only in the little Soviet republics.
Yeah.
This is countrywide.
This is the real deal.
Okay.
Yeah. They also needed to effectively create and distribute propaganda to promote the elections themselves. And all this work and preparation needs to happen prior to the election, which is where the meat of the action, by the way. The real election themselves are window dressing.
It's like graduating university. Like they hand you a diploma.
Yeah.
But it's not like you get up there.
But
and
you have graduated.
It's not like you get up there and you wonder if they're going to give it to you or not. Like it's
Yeah, exactly.
all the work is already done.
That is a good analogy.
Yeah.
So a major bureaucracy was created to handle all of that.
Okay.
For example, in Jiangsu province, 97,000 something cadres were organized to run the process. So the population was about 40 million people, and this means one election worker per 400 citizens. In Shanghai, they had about one election worker per 520 citizens. And it's not just the party officials and local police that were part of the workforce. They also brought in activists, party activists.
Yeah.
Just meaning people who are really enthusiastic
People
about
who are
the
really
party.
active about the party.
Yeah. It's not like people who are active about let's restore the Republic of China,
Yeah.
Housewives, unemployed workers, and unemployed intellectuals were all included in the workforce.
Okay.
This was detailed, thorough work. Even the most remote villages would be covered in the process. And this was a way to survey and measure the population as well, which makes sense, like a census, right?
Yeah.
Before our elections, we have census in America. But different from the census that we know today, the people are labeled either a voter or a non-voter, and the definition was entirely political and public. It was demanded by the election law that, quote, unreformed elements of the landlord class, quote, and, quote, counter-revolutionaries who have been deprived of their civil rights, quote, to be disenfranchised. So nothing different there from before. But the voter registration process makes this labeling official.
And permanent.
There are serious consequences way beyond not being able to vote once you have been labeled a counter-revolutionary.
Yeah.
Sorry, non-voter. But really they mean counter-revolutionary.
Yeah.
So
They mean COVID positive.
Yeah. What I particularly want to mention is that even though the party and the election law said counter-revolutionaries and revolutionaries, leftist or the rightist, landlords and the peasant. These are clear definitions, or they present them as.
Yeah.
However, in reality, the work of classification was still often a confusing, difficult task.
Yeah.
Because obviously these were abstract definitions and categories.
Yeah, maybe you're a peasant who has one field extra that you rent out.
Yeah, exactly.
Right, like.
Yeah. For example, in 1953, a Shanghai district election committee submitted questions to higher authorities. What if a former wife of a landlord who later remarried a member of a working class? Should she be able to vote? What do we do with that? Right? So questions like that come up all the time. What did they do with that? Well, they said that if the wife and her new husband are currently working and they have been relying on their work income for over a year, they can vote. So decisions were made locally.
Yeah.
Really was just a wild card.
Yeah.
And we're not to say it was terrible everywhere in China.
Well, there's this thing that happens, whether it's almost like Imperial China or Mao mass movements or China today, where central direction comes out and it's vague.
Yeah.
And everybody competes to take it to the extreme, to seem as they're the most, eager, they're the most.
Well, here's the thing.
And then
in terms of COVID, for example,
yeah.
There is nothing you can do wrong with making really strict local COVID policies.
Yeah.
You can only go not strict enough.
And if
you can never go too far.
Well, if you does go too far, the government just goes, oh, they were a little too eager, right? Like,
yeah. You won't really be punished for going too far. You will only be punished if you want to keep the economy going and be too loose with COVID.
Yeah. And so, like you said, same thing with the voting laws, how there's nothing in the law itself saying you can only have one candidate. Some of this is for external consumption, right? Yeah. But then internally, because it's vague, people will take everything to the extremes.
Yeah. Well, the internal working guide for local election committees was not vague. No. There are like equal number of candidates to the opening.
But that's not going to get out to the New York Times or whatever.
Or people won't read the fine print, right? Because that's not the law.
Yeah.
And there were conflicts too. For example, some local election committees would suggest that rich peasants can be given the right to vote. However, this will stir up arguments and debates.
Rich peasants is like, in Soviet Union, they were called kulaks, which is just like a class of peasants. There's lots of places where like there wasn't that much land reform, or like you would do land reform, but it didn't solve all the problems. So then it's like, okay, well then we got to keep going. So then you got to then blame like, well, some peasants are too successful.
Yeah, the rich peasants.
So they're not real peasants.
Yeah. So anyways, some might argue the rich peasants are fine. They can be given the right to vote. Some others might feel very confused and angry. Why are we giving anti-revolutionaries this prized opportunity to participate in our country? After all, they had been told to hate these people just a few years prior and probably a few months prior. And surely it does not help that in those years, which is just what you said, the CCP had one political movement after another. There was the Suppress the Counter-Revolutionaries campaign just finished not long ago before this mass mobilization of voter registration had started.
What year?
So
was
memory was
fresh. What year was the first vote supposed to be in?
1954.
Oh, that's when the plan was? Okay.
So memory was fresh. On one hand, the local election committee wanted to give out more voter registration cards, because it wouldn't look so good if like more than half of the country cannot vote.
Yeah.
Some local election workers probably faithfully thought of this voter registration process as a way to draw people closer to the government, right? It was a way to encourage people to think that, oh, now we are the masters of the country or whatever.
Yeah.
But in this effort, some of the people that they give the voter registration cards to may have been just labeled as counter-revolutionaries. And it's like very confusing. And there were nationwide cases of suicides also in response to being rejected a voter registration card. Just in the Jiangsu province, on the record, there were 19 cases of attempted or successful suicides.
And this is, and again, you're saying it represents more than just can you vote, which and the vote is essentially useless in and of itself because there's one candidate.
Yeah.
But it means like, are you a full citizen of this new China, right?
Yeah.
Are you going to be able to get a job? Are you going to be able to access social services? Are you going to be, you know what I mean? All these things.
In the next political movement,
Are you going to be tortured to death?
Yeah, because you have been labeled as non-voter
Yeah.
in this round. So it didn't look good. And some places obviously go too far because they're meant to go too far.
Yeah.
You don't want to go too
Light.
light. So there were recommendations and efforts to educate the local cadres to stop using the quote-unquote inappropriate methods from the land reform, the suppress the counter-revolutionary campaign, and the Five Antis campaign, quote, when conducting voter registration. This was a separate movement, the party said.
Guys, it's not 1951 anymore. You can't just kill all the landlords, okay?
Yes.
We've moved on.
But these other political movements and political training was so successful.
Yeah.
So that it can be very hard to get out of that mindset and get out of the habit to use methods such as intimidation, such as violence, such as blackmailing, which were all too familiar and highly encouraged by the party not just that long ago.
Also, they're fun. You know what I mean? If you're powerless.
Whoa.
Well, you know what I mean? If you're a powerless group of people and suddenly you have power over the society.
To murder people?
I mean, to throw your weight around. I think that's
true. Okay,
it's, you know.
To act like you wear the big pants now.
Yeah, right? To people who, you know, may have.
What is power after all if you don't exercise it?
Yeah, who you might have owed money to before, or you had to work on their farm before.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And now you can kick them in the dirt, right?
Yeah. So, in the report titled, Incidents of Suicide During Test Elections Should Result in Vigilance Everywhere. Meaning like, learn the lesson. Don't play too heavy of a hand. Look at all these suicides.
Okay.
The report came out in 1953, which was part of the Jiangsu Provincial Election Work Report. It was reviewed quite clearly. Some local cadres and election workers believed that, quote, deaths are unavoidable during political campaigns, quote. This attitude was condemned as careless and very incorrect way of thinking by the election committee. But I mean, after all, Mao did say, revolution is not a dinner party.
Can't make an omelet without breaking a few eggs, Cherry.
Exactly. You know, the election report from the same committee in the same year, just a few months later, recorded that one village headman inquired of a visiting election work team, quote, during the election, how many landlords should we identify? How many people should we shoot? Quote. I mean, yeah, it's all funny now, but it's very scary, you know. This is very chilling.
It's not really funny. It's just more, I guess it's just darkly.
Some dark humor for you there.
I mean, it's
even though they were real, it was the reality.
It's like he's asking you about a shoe quota.
Yeah.
Like, okay, how many shoes should we make? You know, how many this color?
Yeah.
Right?
In another county, local cadres asked, quote, is this the second land reform campaign? Who do we struggle against this time? Quote. So, you know, it was too late to hit the brakes.
Yeah.
But of course, this was only 1953. The train was going to accelerate continuously for another 2 decades at least.
Yeah.
Just a heads up. Anyhow, eligible voters were issued voter identification cards, which was to be treasured. As before, lists of eligible voters were posted in public spaces. One worker supposedly said, again, from the election work report, so, you know, take it with a grain of salt. But they said, quote, my name has never been up on a big red announcement board before. This has only happened because of Chairman Mao, quote.
Wow.
You know, again, like you said, some of these people had a very hard life.
Yeah.
Right? And they might actually truly be feeling like, oh my God, you know, like this is
China's standing up.
China's standing up. I'm standing up.
Yeah.
And this
and I don't think, and I'm not mocking that. It's true, and it's important to believe, to understand, like, that to some people this meant a lot to them, even though on the outside it's like.
Well, the party understood that too.
Well, yeah.
This sentiment was not rare. The importance of the voter roll was not to be overlooked. To many, it was a chance for rehabilitation. Mm. If you were a formal adjacent landlord, let's say, or a relative of some rich peasant.
Or you're in the KMT army.
Or if you have worked for the nationalist government. Yeah. Lots of people did. They were the government.
Yeah.
And you get your name on that voter roll, you, the formal undesirable, the formal outpost, you're now back on the team.
You get to put your bean in that bowl like everybody else.
Yeah, exactly. The only one bowl that you get to put it in, but still,
yeah.
You get to do that. And this is not, like, you know, this is more than feeling like you belong. There's real consequences.
Yeah.
And famously, the last emperor, Puyi, got his voter registration card in 1960.
Oh, wow. Even Puyi gets to vote.
After years of imprisonment and re-education, he was a new man. He wrote about this in his autobiography. Quote, I got the voter card with my name on it. It was more valuable than if you added up all the treasures I've ever known in my life. Quote. And he was an emperor, so he has seen a lot of treasures.
It's true.
And then he said, quote, "I put my vote in that red ballot box." This was in Beijing. They had paper ballots.
Yeah,
and
ritzy.
And from that moment on, I felt like the richest person in the world. Together with our 650 million compatriots, I have become the masters of this land of 9.6 million square kilometers. Quote. So, very grand moment.
Yeah, from Puyi.
Yeah. So, there were some other problems, of course. After all these efforts, some of them going too far, not everyone was on board with the party's tight control. Namely, in Shanghai, place that stirs up trouble. Even to this day,
yeah,
civilians complained openly sometimes of how much control the party was.
Well, these are people who, until 4 years ago, were
living a good life.
Were essentially living in a Western.
Yeah.
I mean, you know what I mean?
Yeah. In Beijing, they were organized groups. For example, the Catholics, who took up the majority of a voting district. They ditched the cadres and made their own nominations. Of course, that was squashed down very quickly. In Tianjin, there were official sources complaining that the capitalists held banquets, networked, and studied election law. Supposedly, that's inappropriate. How dare you study the country's law?
Yeah.
You must be up to no good. But they tried to get nominated by, doing some bribes, I guess. So, same to this day.
Yeah.
So that was the preparation. What about the elections themselves? When it's the day and the time to exercise one's rights?
Yeah.
Not. First of all, it's not the same election you will see today in democratic countries. You don't just go to the poll and cast your ballot and you leave. You don't go into a little booth with no one seeing what you're filling out.
Okay.
So most of the times, you basically go to a rally of some sort at a grand event hall that would be decorated for the occasion. Everyone arrives at the same time. A meeting chairperson would explain the election procedures and introduce the nominated candidates. Even though the election law had permitted written ballots, outside of cities, very few elections used them. Most of the time, it was either show of hands or vote by voice. So, very public voting. And obviously, you can say, yes, the masses are illiterate, which would be a convenient situation for the party anyways. But the personal and political cost of opposition, having to raise your hand in front of a hall of people and party officials.
Have to shout no
in
a crowd of people.
Against candidates that the party had chosen.
Yeah.
So you better think twice before you do that. And the official report of how the elections went was overwhelmingly positive. Claims such as, quote, "Elections created the mindset of being the nation's master," quote, or gave the people the opportunity to form unity, was everywhere. The voter participation rate, though, I don't know why I said though, overwhelmingly high. A democratic country today can only dream of these voter registration rates. Of these voter participation rates. For example, Jiangsu province, 56% of the population was recognized as eligible voters.
Only 56%. Well, I guess you have kids and stuff.
Well, yeah, you have to be above a certain age. Out of 80% of those voters, which was 19 million people, supposedly voted. The national voter participation rate, 85%.
Wow.
Or was it 95? I remember it was 95. Did I type it wrong? It was even higher. I'll just say that.
Yeah. Truly democracy that
it's
works.
really, it's really easy to get a high turnout when they don't have the option to not vote,
Yeah.
But of course, that's just the official report. If you read the unofficial reports, they keep on the down low. In Shanghai, one voter who did not raise her hands as she should have, claimed that she didn't even know what she was doing there, nor what kind of meeting it was. She only knew that she was told to be there. Some other voters claimed, "I'm too old and too uneducated. Just tell me who to vote for."
Yeah.
Which the party did. And not because you're old and uneducated. They told everyone who to vote for. People complained that the election was a waste of time. Who has so much free time? In areas with food shortage, it was questioned that people don't even have anything to eat. What do they need an election for?
So I think I've read that in some places in the Soviet Union, when they'd give you elections, they'd give you stuff at the election place. Like you come to go vote and they'd give you like a bag of flour.
I'm sure that's likely happens too. I'm sure.
Oh, okay.
So the first nationwide election to elect people's representatives of the PRC, by all official counts, was a success.
Wow.
And you know what? I tend to agree with them. Not in the way that it gave people a choice.
No.
Or that people exercised their rights.
Excellent smokescreen.
Yeah, exactly. It was successful in terms of giving the party yet another opportunity for mass political training.
Yeah.
For good propaganda.
Yeah.
For increased international image.
Yeah.
Right? And obviously now they can claim that China has elections now, like Albania. Stalin will no longer be on Mao's ass about this. So, to the next election in 1956, supposedly 93% of voter participation rate. Crazy. And then it just keeps going every 3 years, I think. However, though, this was a short-lived passion project of the CCP because Mao's heart really wasn't in this.
No.
Even though we keep going, this is Mao style, election laws, which in many ways it was. But his hands were more or less forced, right?
Yeah.
He had paid not that much attention to the elections, but his prized baby, for example, the anti-rightist movement started in 1957 and took the nation by storm. Only a few years after this large voter registration and election efforts.
Mao's version of democracy is like when he's like, I think 1 in every 20 person is a secret rightist.
5%.
Yeah. And then everybody has to decide who the secret rightist is in their like cadre.
Yeah.
And then like kill them or like imprison them. And it's like,
yeah.
I feel like that's Mao's version of democracy.
Exactly.
Like,
so the anti-rightist movement, in a way, really marked Mao's comeback into the center of the political stage. Because you know how we talk about, revolutionaries. Certain people are very good at revolutionaries.
Yeah.
Very good at revolutions.
Yeah.
Mao being one of them. But then it's time some people feel like, okay, we've gotten China now.
Yeah.
Right? We are in power. Now maybe it's time to build the country. But people like Mao, who are good at revolutions, feel like that's not their
running a
strength.
country and like ensuring food security is a different skill set than can you lead a revolutionary army?
Yeah. So, but Mao is not going to retire.
No.
The anti-rightist movement in 1957, only 4 years after 1953, the voter registration effort, in the election effort, really marked Mao's comeback into the center of political stage in China. And from that point on, until his death in 1976, the election was not the priority.
Did they even have them?
They had them, but the People's Daily and all these party propaganda newspapers and magazines reported on them less and less and less and less. So there wasn't an official election in 1958 and another one in 1960, which Puyi voted in. And then Great Leap Forward happens too, during which elections were still organized in some cities, again, Puyi in Beijing, but the People's Daily was very quiet on the topic of elections that year. Perhaps because thousands of people starving to death in the countryside and elections were not really compatible as a result. And then Cultural Revolution happens, all hell broke loose. I found some records of people like the University of Beijing electing its leaders of the Red Guards. Yeah. And I'm like, I don't know if that's
the same thing.
So our episode ends here today.
It's like saying we have democracy, our mobs elect their own leaders.
Yeah, exactly. So Mao passed away in 1976. And 3 years later, in 1979, because, there was a coup after his death, basically. And, people had to figure out who's going to be in power. And Deng Xiaoping turned out to be the man of China. But in 1979, after a few years, they got their ducks in a row.
Yeah.
In 1979, a new election law came to be in China. For that, we will see you next episode. Wow. So obviously we are saying that, we're talking about elections and voting in China. But really the meat of the action happens at all the things that comes before the day of the election.
Yeah.
You can't say that the CCP hasn't done a lot of work revolving elections and its infrastructure.
Yeah.
They really have. But just not for the reason you think of what a democracy requires. It was the opposite of that, and it was very effective. And that's the tricky part. It took me a while for me to wrap my head around it.
Well, the interesting thing to me is that besides it, obviously not being democratic or deciding anything, right? Because it's just a single candidate, the party picks them. The thing that is actually surprises me is that it actually seems fairly sensible and fairly organized for something that would happen in Maoist China. And I think that's because it's not something that comes from Maoist China. Something comes from the Soviet Union. Mm-hmm. And they basically...
Mao just had to do it.
Yeah, right? And it's basically arranged along Soviet lines.
Yeah.
Right? And they're like, let's not get too crazy with it. Let's try, you know what I mean? Like...
Well, they did get too crazy with it, but, they could say that it wasn't the intention of the election committee.
But if it was Mao, it would have been crazy from the start. And like just the fact that this is all rather calm and organized, relatively speaking, is interesting to me. And it also shows why Mao had no interest in doing it. Right?
So boring.
Yeah. Like maybe if it was an election to figure out who's the most reactionary in the village and struggle session them, then maybe he'd be interested in doing it.
Then maybe he would, yeah.
But like just this sort of formulaic kind of bureaucracy
stuff. Kind
of
anticlimactic.
Yeah. He's completely bored by.
Yeah. It's not like he can go to the election to be elected himself.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like it's not his rally.
And also in the 1960s, that's when the split with the Soviet Union happened. Mm-hmm. Right? So there's less reason to
care
up
the appearance.
Yeah.
And care about what Big Brother Stalin thought.
Well, he was dead by then, so it was Khrushchev, I think.
Okay,
but same thing, right?
Yeah.
To just not care about it. Well, there was I think it was Khrushchev, but basically whenever Mao would go to Soviet Union, and this is almost like some opium war stuff. Whenever Mao would go to the Soviet Union, Stalin would treat him terribly. Like wouldn't meet him, would put him in the crappy hotel, right? And Mao really admired, like Mao was annoyed at Stalin, but also Mao kind of like almost looked at him in some ways as a role model to like how you really keep control of stuff.
Yeah.
And then when like Khrushchev come over and would be like nice to Mao and kind of try and Mao would treat him. Mao would treat him.
Can I say something?
Badly, yeah.
A bully knows a bully.
Yeah. Definitely.
Why do you think Trump loves Putin?
Yeah. Stalin's definitely a bully's bully.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I'm excited to learn about modern Chinese election law.
Yeah.
I've seen all those pictures of Xi Jinping putting his little ballot in the box.
Yeah, I don't know. Does he get to vote?
He does. There's all these propaganda pictures of him casting his vote.
Well, I guess the American president votes on election day as well, right?
Yeah,
there's all
votes.
these, So he's a citizen.
Well, hopefully that gives you some context when you hear about like, oh, China had votes, Mao had voting. It's like, well, kind of. Sort of.
Yeah.
If you only can pick one person to vote for and it doesn't really matter if you do or don't. And if you don't, you're probably going to get shunned by the whole community. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah. Cool.
Well, thank you for listening and look out for some more episodes and see you next time.
See you next time.